Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard Fajardo, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. So, on behalf of the owners and of the staff, I would like to welcome all of you to Politics and Prose for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose have gone back to hosting in-person events, along with virtual book events, partnered events, trips, and classes. So please check our website for a full list. And a little bit of housekeeping before we start. First, while we have lifted the mask mandate here in the store, you are encouraged to wear a mask throughout the event, and we can provide one for you if you did not bring one. If you could also turn off or silence your cell phones, we would really appreciate it. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone by the pillar over here before asking your questions, so we can not only hear and enjoy the conversation, but to also ensure that it is going to be recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them right behind the cash registers, and we will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so please line up by the pillar after the event if you want your book signed. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. I am honored to introduce Patricia Engel to all of you. Patricia's last novel, Infinite Country, was published to critical and widespread acclaim, landing her in the New York Times bestseller list and nominations for the Dublin Literary Award and the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. She is a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. Her stories appear in the Best American Short Stories, the Best American Mystery Stories, the O. Henry Prize Stories, and elsewhere. She is currently an Associate Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Miami. This evening, she will be talking about her new short story collection, The Faraway World. In these 10 profound and arresting stories, Patricia showcases her writing prowess once again by writing about the dispossessed and the unmoored. In a star review from Kirkus Reviews, they said that The Faraway World is a pleasure to read. Engel's multinational update of dirty realism is full of ironic flair, imagination, and empathy. She will be in conversation with Marie Arana today. Marie is a Peruvian-American author of nonfiction and fiction, as well as the inaugural literary director of the Library of Congress. She is the recipient of a 2020 Literary Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Among her recent positions are director of the National Book Festival, the John W. Kluge Center's Chair of the Cultures of the Countries of the South, and writer-at-large for the Washington Post. For many years, she was editor-in-chief of the Washington Post's book review section, Book World. So everyone, let us welcome Patricia Engel and Marie Arana.
Can you hear me? Yes, good. Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. Good to see some friends out of the audience coming out in the rain. Thank you so much for sticking with politics and prose and books in general, and this wonderful author, Patricia Engel, whom I'm honored to be sitting next to tonight. This is, I can't say enough about politics and prose as a great literary institution in this city. I think we know that, or we wouldn't be sitting here. I'm so grateful to it for having programs such as this, and for giving me the opportunity to meet some of the writers whom I admire. And Patricia is certainly one of those. I've admired her work for a while, and I was thrilled to see and to read this current book, The Faraway World, which indeed takes you to 10 faraway worlds, quite beautifully written, wonderfully imagined. I can't wait to talk to her about where those stories come from. So let me start, Patricia, first of all, by welcome. Oh, I should say we have lots in common, although we've just met tonight. We are both, obviously immigrant families. We both grew up in New Jersey. I came to this country at 9 years old, and Patricia was actually born, and probably just a few miles away from from our hometowns. And we both published with Simon & Schuster. I'm a proud former editor of Simon & Schuster, so it's always good to see your publisher actually acquiring great books and great diverse writers. So that's a pleasure. I'm sure we have some other things in common as well. But Patricia, let's start with one thing, storytelling, which is a great tradition in Latin America. And you probably grew up with it, as I did in my family, with stories just, you know, in the kitchen, on the dinner table, you know, between neighbors, gossip, family dramas, all of that sort of stuff that feeds your imagination. But where do your stories, where did these stories come from?
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for braving the rain, and the cold for coming out here this evening, and also to Politics and Prose for hosting us, and Marie, who I am a huge admirer of, and I'm so happy to be here with her. And she has, not only is she a brilliant writer, she has a fascinating life. We were just talking a bit about it. So I'm so grateful for this space and that we can be here together just to talk about books. It's a beautiful thing. So yeah, you are correct. Storytelling, I think, is a human tradition, but perhaps it's more obvious in Latin American families. And I think it takes on even bigger weight in families who have immigrated, no matter the background, because storytelling is a way to remember who you were before the crossing over, before the leaving wherever you came from to come to the new place. It's a way to tell the next generation who they are and to make meaning and find the purpose, the reason for so many things in life. And I think as humans, we're always looking for those explanations. We're always looking for those reasons. And storytelling is really the only way we can do that. And I think somebody said that it's really the only thing that separates us from other species. As far as the stories in the Faraway World, there are 10 short stories here. And I wrote this book, or what came to be this book, over the last 10 or 12 years while I was writing other books. I wrote 4 other books before this one, and I was writing these stories all the way through. So they were each written at very different periods of my life. You can imagine a lot of things happen in 12 years, right? I was thinking about a lot of different things, exploring just different ideas, different philosophical approaches to life, and I think those came through in the stories. But I think I would have to pick each story apart to tell you where each come from, because the fact is, I'm sure you know as a writer, stories come at you from all directions, you know. It can come in a thread as subtle as a conversation you may overhear, maybe something that you heard on the TV while you were cooking in the next room. It can come from just daydreaming and thinking about the what if, remembering something that had happened and maybe letting your brain drift into that space of what if it had gone another way, and all of a sudden, you know, you've taken ownership of your imagination and you're in another story. So those threads come all the time in different ways. And then the fun of it, and eventually the art of it, is allowing your mind to make those connections and then to attribute meaning, to attribute story, and to attribute characters to these experiences in order to give all this a life and a world.
That is so true. I mean, the business of just tiny wisps of experience, or just a phrase that can propel a book into life. I had my own experience. I remember my book Lima Nights. I was sitting at tea time with my parents, and my father suddenly said to my mother, "Pablo Schmidt is so desperate that he is consulting the Grand Shaman of Lima." And just that line, just that one sentence, it was like, what would drive a scientist, an engineer, his best friend, to suddenly to be so in love and so out of line in that love that he would go. And I had a feeling that this is how some of these stories were born. It's interesting because what you say is that you've written them at different times of your life, at different times of your writing life, but they hang together so well. And I want to ask you about that, because in each story, wait, I've got to read some things that people have said about her, which apply to this book. Radiant, diamond sharp, and your language is really diamond sharp. It's wonderful, sort of beautifully crafted, but also spare and very elegant. Gloriously gifted and alarmingly intelligent, says Junot Diaz. Anyway, in these glorious, intelligent, diamond-sharp stories, all 10 of these, they revolve around two people generally. It's generally a couple that has been brought together by bizarre and unexpected circumstances, or people who are struggling against one another, or people who are longing for one another. It's always a duo in your stories, and so the book hangs together. Even though, was this on purpose that you did this?
You know, it was not, and that's one of the things that. Thank you for pointing that out, because I didn't notice, but it's true, and I don't think that's different from how life operates. We don't operate as individuals against the world. Maybe in our minds we do, but on a practical level, no, all our interactions are personal, one by one, even in a sequence, even if we're, among a group. I think that in writing, relationships are a great human stage. It's in relationships that you find out who you are. You find out things about yourself that you would never find out otherwise. You would never find out if you just remained, alone. And in the case of writing these stories, there are stories in this book where it is very specifically focused on one character and another and what happens between the two of them. But there are others where it's a bit more prismatic, and perhaps those two are part of a collective, and what is going on between them speaks to what is going on, in the larger community. So I think what's also interesting to explore is how you can get a sense of a whole community, a whole culture even, just by observing what's going on between two people at times. We see that in relationships all the time. We see what's going on in society by how a couple are interacting with one another at times. And so I think that's just, the fun of writing, is letting those things shine through on an intimate level.
One thing that really struck me, that strikes me about your writing, and particularly about this book, is that Latin America and Latinidad are very present in this book, to be sure, but it's so structured around the characters themselves that it could be Ethiopians, it could be Iranians, it could be Germans. You can actually, and I put this out as an experiment to you, to read this almost, they're so human. That you could imagine any culture actually reacting in this, immigrant culture reacting in this way and interfacing in this way. There is a sort of a suspension. You don't have to be. I think Colombia is present, Cuba is present. Is there another Latin America? I think it's basically those two in this book.
Yeah, there are some intersections of other communities, but those are probably the most prevalent.
Right. But there is a sort of universality about it, and maybe I also happen to be a critic, so maybe I'm projecting on this. But what do you think about that? What do you think about the fact that really it could be, It could be something that would be very present in another immigrant culture?
I don't really think about it, to be honest. And I think it's because I don't think about myself as being some little bubble of life or compartmentalize myself as this independent unit of a cultural experience. When I write these stories, I think, You know, what are these characters thinking about when they're alone in their bedroom or when they wake up in the morning or before they go to bed at night? They're not thinking about their passport, you know, or their birth certificate. They're thinking about their, you know, their desires, their fears, their longings, their pains, their sorrows, their family, the people they love, the people, their, you know, all those things. So that is, you know, that is, I guess, what you would call, you know, a universal human through line. But I think that about what you were saying about it being something that is common to those who have an immigration story very close to them, right? Like you and I have it here, right? As opposed to other people who maybe have it further back in their family history. And because of that, we have our sense of displacement right here. We have our sense of disorientation, our outsiderness, our imposter syndromes. It's all sitting on our shoulders all the time, right? It takes a couple of generations for that to go away, but we're still deeply in it. We also have that sense of movement, of loss, of having left, you know, of having left people who are still there, right? And those connections, all very vivid and alive. So that's very particular to people who are living diaspora in the present moment. And I think that's something that I explore in all my work. I try to, because of course that's something that I'm trying to understand in my own life, that ever-changing condition of what migration does over time, how it changes families, how in one generation or two, you're completely different. And that has always fascinated me.
You use a term, I think you are the one who, I'm not sure whether you used it in an interview that I read or actually in this book or somewhere, but you refer to, I think, to soul memory. And it's a memory that we have not necessarily of an event or an experience that's specific, but it's almost like the Brazilian word, the Portuguese word saudade, which is it's just a longing. And that's very present in your work, that sense of longing for something else, for another world, a faraway world. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in Spanish, the closest we could get to is like añoranza, right? And it's not just like a homesickness. It's more than that. It's more than that. It's so deep in you, right? And that's something that is one of the beautiful mysteries of movement, of changing locations, of migration, and that is something that I do explore, is inheritance in all its forms, not just the stories like we started talking about, but all those parts of ourselves that we think are our personality, right? But they're really not. They come from much deeper. You know, we're just starting to learn about how illness and trauma is carried in the DNA, and you know, we think of all the bad things, right? And we're like, oh, we blame your ancestors for that, right? But there's a lot of good things and beautiful things and mystical and magical things and gifts that I think are carried in those very small particles, down to the blood, bones, and soul, you could say.
Speaking of blood, bones, and soul, we have something else in common, which is that we come from Andean countries. So there's something very specific about Andean countries. The legends are very similar. The empires, the civilizations are very similar. The Muisca in Bogota, and of course the Inca, where I come from, and the Moche. And you actually employ those legends. Did you grow up with those legends?
To a point, and listen, there's no bigger expert than Marie here on all those things. To a point, because my mother was from Bogota and that region, and so my mother very proudly shared those legends with us growing up. And but as you know, Colombia is a very diverse country, right? And what is particular to Bogota is not particular to other regions who have their own mythology and their own ancestral knowledge and lore. So I had a sense of Muisca and Chibcha lore up to a point, but the rest I started to pick up while traveling in Colombia, especially like for my books and going to different regions. And that's part of what we were just saying, how not only is it something that we carry through storytelling, through our DNA, but also the ways that the land makes us who we are, the lands we come from. You say that we're very particular about, there's something very particular about being Andean, right? And I remember one time I traveled with my parents to a very far country in the same latitude, and we got off the plane and they said, "This feels like Bogota." And then why, you know? And we were on the same latitude. And how is it something? Is it the air? Is it, you know, how far the sun is? That all of a sudden triggers this profound sense of memory. I remember my mother on a, you know, a bit warmer than it is here, maybe like 65 degrees, overcast day. Without fail, my mother would walk outside and say, "It's just like Bogota." Instant, right? How that would, and I could never understand that about her, you know, until I started spending more time there. And then as I got older, I started to have those kinds of deep memory reactions, then I could start to understand what that does, how that transports you. So it's so much bigger than us in this moment, right? The things that we carry.
Tell me and tell us a little bit about how you started as a writer. Was this always an inclination? Did you, is this something in the family? There's so much, I want to say that I feel that there is such rhythm and carefulness about the sound in your writing that I almost feel like you must have played the piano or the flute or something.
Oh, if my family heard you say that, they would laugh and laugh, because I have a lot of musicians in my family and the musical gene skipped me.
Came up
Yes. I have a good ear for music, but I can't play. But I do come from a very creative family, as I said. There's a lot of musicians and painters, and everyone is very artistically inclined in my family, which is, you know, wonderful. My grandmother was the one who wrote. My grandmother had 9 children. She wrote compulsively, but privately. She did write these epic letters that she would send to people. She wrote poems that she shared and things like that. But she wrote entire books that
She never published?
No. And I don't even know if she cared to. She just did it for herself and put it away. So that was my first and only example of what it meant to be a writer for a very long time. It was something you did for yourself. Not that you needed to show it to anybody. And that's how I started. I wanted to be a painter when I was a little kid, and I would draw and doodle all day long. But once I learned how to write, I started putting captions on my drawings, and then my captions just got longer and longer and kind of took over and became stories, and I started drawing less and less. And that's how it started. And I kept a lot of diaries. I never shared my work with anybody. I did it for myself. I thought that's what you did. And that's all I needed. I did it to entertain myself and keep myself company. I loved reading, but I think a lot of people who become writers end up writers because they love reading, but they start to feel like there's got to be something more. There's books that I want that are not there, and then you feel like you've got to go write them. And that's kind of how I ended up doing it.
Did you major in creative writing or English at NYU?
No, I majored in French and art history.
Okay.
Yeah. And I took a creative writing class, and I really wanted to write, but like I said, I wasn't sharing it. So no one ever told me I was really, talented or anything like that. And I remember I went to see a creative writing professor during his office hours, and I said, I really love writing, and what can I do to be better? I want to be serious about it. And he said, you? And like, that was it. I left. And that shut me down for a couple of years, I just went back to writing for myself. I did have a philosophy teacher who was just amazing. And we had to write these weekly assignments. We had to read a lot, and we had to write these, kind of apply what you just read for the philosophy class to current events and current life. But he allowed us to be personal about it and creative about it. So I had some fun with these, and I would write them. And he started writing me notes, you know, Patricia, you're a really good writer. You should keep doing this. And then they would be like more intense, and he would say, "You're a writer. Do not stop." And then I remember at the end, I took 2 classes with him. He told me, he took me aside, and he was like a very kind of serious man, and he called me Patty. He said, "Patty, you're a writer. It's going to be very hard, but you need to do it." And that was all he said, and that kept me going for many more years. That's all I needed. And then I eventually, you know, many years later, applied to graduate school, and that's how I got on a more formal track. But I had never studied creative writing in a formal way before that.
And do you feel that that MFA was transformational or not necessarily?
Oh, an MFA is a beautiful thing in that it just gives you time to write. I mean, what more do you want? What you do with it is up to yourself. I teach an MFA program now. I'm a creative writing professor. You know, it's a different experience for a different person. When I got there, that's all I cared about. I thought, oh my God, I'm so lucky to be here. I have 3 years, and that's all I get to just talk about books like we're doing tonight, and stories and write. You know, I that's all I expected, and that was plenty for me.
I want to talk a little bit about Latinidad, about the Hispanicity, about being Latino in this country, because I happen to be writing a book about it, so I want to hear this from you. My question to you is, based on the fact I look around and see the people who have commented on your books and who have supported your books, and they're not necessarily Colombian. They are people with Latino experience, and they are Latinos who are writing in this country and trying to capture what it is that we have to offer as immigrants, as Latin Americans who have, you know, been present forever in this country, really all the way back since before the Pilgrims even arrived. So I want to ask you, and this is very specific, how do you fit into that population? And does that population, do you feel it's united? Does it feed you in any way? Do you describe yourself as a Latina or a Hispanic or a Latinx? Or are you an immigrant from from an immigrant family from Colombia, specifically?
Well, I don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about these things because I'm more busy, you know, working and just living ordinary life. But if it comes down to it, yes, of course, I have been nothing else in my life except the daughter of Colombians. That's the only way I have ever experienced the world. So that probably takes precedence over any other identity marker. But of course, when you live in diaspora, you find a larger community of people from across the Americas, and we have certain things in common. We have certain differences. But there is a common human story in that, and there's enough that carries over where you feel a sense of camaraderie or a sense of being part of a larger family. So that's wonderful too. As you know, the names for things have changed. They changed decade by decade. I mean, when I was coming up, we didn't have any of these terms that we have now. And the ones that were more commonly thrown around were on the pejorative side. But I think specificity is beautiful too. So I am happy to embrace, you know, I don't know, how can we call it? I don't want to say the hyphen, because I think, you know, that creates a fracturing as well. But to be of Colombian heritage in the United States, and I don't know why we have to we only allow ourselves one word at a time, right, to describe ourselves, instead of allowing our story to be our descriptors. You know, why can't we have a few words to kind of just say a little bit more? I don't know, but I find this all very interesting, as I'm sure you do, because it asks us to think about ourselves and how we've gotten this far, and how we see ourselves, and how we choose to be seen.
Right, and of course the commonality of the Spanish language, which I know is very present in your work. I can feel it in your work. Do you write in Spanish?
I mean, my creative writing is in English, which is the language of, most of my education. But I do write in Spanish. I'm obviously stronger in writing in English, but thankfully, one of the things that my mother left me is the knowledge for reading and writing in Spanish. So I tend to write shorter pieces. And I have made attempts at writing longer forms in Spanish, but I haven't, completed anything there yet.
Well, I'm in the same boat. I mean, it's very hard to find what in linguistics is termed a bilingual, somebody who feels, totally comfortable in every sense, professionally, personally, and intimately, and not. And so that's a very hard thing to reach, particularly if you're working in English all the time.
Especially because language is always changing too, right? It changes with generations. It changes year to year. What phrasings that were used a few years ago feel out of date now. So, but I've had a lot of fun working on translations. I don't know if you've worked on any translations, and that's really kind of putting muscle to language and seeing the interchange and how meaning is translated and the choices you have to make in translation. That's fun too.
And the whole cultural context of whatever you're translating is really interesting. Would you read something for us from your new book?
Yes, I would be happy to. I'll just read something short from the beginning of the book, from the first story, which is about two twin sisters, and I think that's all I need to say. The detective wanted to know if Aida was the sort of girl who would run away from home. He'd asked to talk to me alone in the living room. My parents stood around the kitchen with the lady cop and the other detective, an old man who looked to be on his last days of the job. I sat in the middle of the sofa, my thighs parting the cushions. The detective sat on the armchair our mother recently had reupholstered with a fleur-de-lis print because the cat had clawed through the previous paisley. The old man detective was telling my parents Aida would walk through that front door any minute now. She probably just got distracted, wandered off with some friends. Our mother wasn't crying yet, but she was close. He looked young to be a detective. He wore jeans with a flannel shirt under a tweed blazer, even though it was August. He wanted to know if Aida had ever talked about leaving, like she had plans beyond this place, something else waiting for her somewhere. I shook my head. I didn't tell him that since we were 11, Aida and I kept a shoebox in the back of our closet under some long-forgotten stuffed animals that we called our runaway fund. The first year or two, we added every extra dollar we came across, and when our piles of bills became thick and messy, we took them to the bank and traded them for 20s. We planned to run away and join a group of travelers, sleep under bridges beside other refugee kids and form orphan families like you see in movies and Friday night TV specials. Those were the days before we understood how much our parents needed us. Aida insisted on taking the cat with us. Andromeda was fat but could fit in her backpack. Aida had lied to our parents and said she found the cat alone one day by the river behind the soccer field, but she'd really bought her at the pet shop with some of our runaway savings. I didn't mind. The cat always loved her more than me, though. Does she have a boyfriend? Somebody special? She didn't. Neither did I. Our parents told us boys were a big waste of time, and we kept busy with other things. School, sports, jobs, painting classes for Aida, and piano lessons for me. Our parents said just because we were girls who lived in a small town didn't mean we had to be small town girls. Did she have any secrets? Not from me. Even twins keep secrets from each other. He made me tell him all over again what happened, even though I'd gone through it several times before in the kitchen, while the old man detective took notes and the lady cop leaned against the refrigerator, arms folded across her blockish breasts. The young detective said he'd keep whatever I told him in the strictest confidence. If there's something you left out because your parents weren't around, now is the time to tell me. There's nothing, I said, and repeated all I'd already told them, how Aida was coming off her summer job as a gift wrapper at the children's department store at the bottom of Elm Avenue while I was sweeping and cleaning the counters before closing at the coffee shop on the top end where I worked the pastry case. We had this routine. Whoever finished her shift first would call to say they were on their way to the other. Or we'd meet halfway at our designated third bench on the sidewalk in front of Memorial Park, and we'd walk home together. That night, a little after 7, Aida had called and said, "I'll come to you." When she didn't show up, I took my purse and walked across the intersection to the park. I sat on our bench for a few minutes before walking the park periphery to see if maybe she'd run into some kids from school. Aida was friendly with everyone, even the dropouts most everyone in town avoided, though they hung around the bus station and liquor store, and you couldn't walk through the park without getting a whiff of their weed. Aida had a smile for everyone. People liked her. Sometimes I got the impression they just tolerated me because we were a package deal. I called her phone, but she didn't answer. Then I tried our parents to see if they'd heard from her. It started from there, the calling around. Probably for the first time ever, the town employed that emergency phone chain where each person is assigned 5 others to call to see if anyone had seen Aida. Around here, you can't get a haircut without it being blasted over the gossip wires, but nobody knew where she was. This is a town where nothing terrible ever happens. There are perverts and creeps like anywhere else, but never an abduction or a murder. The worst violent crime this town ever saw, beyond an occasional housewife wandering the supermarket with a broken nose or a split lip, was back in 1979 when one sophomore girl stabbed another with a pencil in the high school cafeteria. The old man detective reminded us we had the good fortune of living in one of the safest towns on the East Coast. This isn't some third world country, he told our mother. The likelihood that your daughter was kidnapped is extremely remote. He told our parents it was common for teenagers to test boundaries. If he only had $1 for every time a parent called looking for a kid who it turned out had just taken off to a rock concert at the Meadowlands or hopped into a car with some friends and headed down the shore. And it'd only been 4 hours, he emphasized. Aida couldn't have gotten very far. Our mother argued that 4 hours could take her to Boston, to Washington, so far into Pennsylvania that she might as well be in another country. 4 hours was enough to disappear into nearby New York City, her dark, pretty face bleeding into millions of others. But the old detective insisted, 4 hours is nothing, ma'am. You'll see. You'll see. So...
A lot happens in that story. That's really wonderful. And it's wonderful to hear somebody, an author, read, because all the inflection is there. It's wonderful. Thank you. Now, your questions, please. We've got a microphone right over here, right next to this pillar. Maybe you can't see it, but it's right around this pillar. If you would come and ask your questions or your comments. Talk about your experiences, perhaps, as a writer or a reader. Welcome the questions.
Thank you for being here and for reading. I have a question. I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned that your grandmother used to write. Have you ever considered doing something with what she wrote, if you have some sort of access to it, or?
Oh, thank you. I only have personal writings of hers, letters that she wrote to me, and a couple of notebooks that she gave me, mostly travel notes, and some letters that she wrote to other people who have given them to me over the years, and that's really all that I have or have access to. So I haven't thought about it that much, mainly because I don't have much. I also don't know what her wishes would have been, and that's really what I would have wanted to respect, because I write a lot that never gets published, so yeah, that's maybe something I'll think about in time, but I still feel I've got a lot of other things to write. Thank you.
So you build your characters so beautifully, and they're so full. I'm interested in your approach to character building in a short story versus your longer form writing. Do the characters just come to you, or is it more of a sit down sort of approach, map?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think characters come to me the same way, whether it's for a short form or for a longer form. Um, it's more the story that creates a larger architecture. But what I love, because all of this really comes down to me as a reader and what my tastes are as a reader, I love the intensity of a novel, and the goal for me is always to try to replicate that in a shorter form. I love novels that feel like they have the range or the intensity of what maybe a novel can offer in some way. Obviously, you can't do the whole thing, but so I do the same character work, no matter the form. I really feel that I need to know a character intimately, deeply, psychologically, emotionally, how they express themselves, the language they use in order to create their voice. I need to know their whole story before I even sit down to write a story. So I sit with the story a very long time before I attempt to write it. I think about it for a long time. In that way, it's similar. I do similar work. I have a similar process for novel writing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for your reading. I loved it. And I just wanted to know, do you have any like beta readers? Do you have anybody who, reads some of your first drafts, second drafts, third drafts? What's your process in that regard?
Sounds like a writer's question.
That's a good question. And, it has changed. Obviously, when you're in something like an MFA program, you're sharing your early work all the time. At this point, I don't. And I think it really goes back to how I started out. Like I was saying, I wrote only for myself. And that's really where I found the most joy in entertaining myself by my writing. But that's also how I came to understand my work. So I don't really share my work at all until I feel, certainly not first draft, but I have a stronger draft. Obviously, everything requires revision. And then I share it with my agent. My agent is really my first reader in that respect. And she's a wonderful reader and a wonderful editor. And then we begin talking about it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Another question?
Oh, yeah. Hi. This was something that I had been thinking about. I really loved Infinite Country. I'm excited to read this one. And then with what you just said about sort of like imbuing the short stories with this intensity, which I think Infinite Country has as well. While your work carries this intensity, there's also so much hope and light. Is that like intentional, or how do you kind of find that balance in your writing?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's important to me. I love intensity or depth or range, because I think that's how we live our lives, right? We live our lives with that kind of intensity and depth and range, and we feel things deeply and profoundly. We are affected and moved, and that's what I go for in my writing. At the same time, what's important, I think more truer to life, are those contrasts. The difficult moments are difficult, but they're not all the time. And certainly they coexist with joy in our lives and with hope. And I think hope is right there with desire, right? Hope is what gets us out of bed. It's our biggest motivating force. Sometimes we disguise it with the idea of ambition, right? Or goals or things like that. But what is that really, other than hope? Right? That's what creates all the energy of movement in this world, is hoping that every day is going to be better than the one before, that maybe you're going to feel a little better, that you're going to, be further along in whatever it is you're hoping for. But again, it's that energy of hope. So I just think it's intrinsic to the human experience. It's certainly how I approach life. And I try for my stories to reflect that, or be mirrors in some way of that kind of experience.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I have a question for you, which it comes to mind from everything that you've said, and I wonder, you're right. I think that so many of us, and I really resonate to this, write because you haven't seen this anywhere else. and this happens to, biographers who take up, figures that have been written about endlessly, but they haven't seen them written about in a certain way or with a certain voice or with a certain perspective, and so they launch in. But at the same time, you must have models. You must have writers who shaped you, who actually sparked you in a way that others did not. Could you tell us about those?
Yeah, I think my most enduring influences, or my earliest and teachers of writing, are those that came to me the earliest in my life, or when I really started to think in my mind, I want to write and be a writer. And that happened when I was around age 14, 15, when I really kind of came into consciousness about it. The books that I was coming across, because of course, the books you came across are the ones at your local bookstore, at the library. At the time, my brother is a few years older than me, so he had books that he was reading in school that I could kind of like dip into too at times. But the books that made great impact on me at that time, the authors were Maurice Condé, Guadeloupean writer, Albert Camus, Marguerite Duras, Anaïs Nin, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who my mother, was really, pushed on us a lot. Isabel Allende. So those, they arrived all around the same period of time when I was really just kind of becoming alert to the idea of writing was something I could do as a practice. And so they kind of are like my godparents of writing in some way.
Yeah, the padrinos. Mary Kay.
Well, this is a question that sort of triangulates the other two questions, which is the notion of audience in your head. So Michelle was asking about beta readers, and Marie was asking about that which exists and that which doesn't, and wanting to tell more stories that reflect your own thoughts and imaginary, the soup, the broth that you come from. And so I just wonder if your notion of audience has changed over the years.
Question.
Certainly, I think you can't help that once you publish a book, right? When I wrote my first book, what became my first book, I wrote it bit by bit, and I had no idea it was going to become a book, and I also hoped it would be published. I didn't know if it would. And then it got published, and I thought, well, I hope someone reads it. I didn't know if it would. So at that point in my life, audience was just, I didn't think about it at all. I was my audience, and that was that. Over time, The Faraway World is my fifth book. So obviously from book to book, different readers connect to it. So audience, I don't think about it as audience. I think about it like this. It's a community of readers, right? It's an offering. It's something that I share. I think about it less as performance, or, that I have to deliver. I think about it as an ongoing conversation, as an ongoing exploration. And what I'm doing is creating depictions, or portraits that I hope move people, because, like I said, I came to this as, my own audience. I fundamentally want to be moved by my own work. Otherwise, I would be bored by it and I wouldn't finish anything. So I hope by the time I'm done writing something, that a reader could, share in some of that experience as well, and then a connection develops, right? And I think it's a beautiful way to connect with others.
Well, that's the perfect place to stop. I see the clock is counting down. I want to say it's been a real pleasure speaking to you, Patricia, and I think we all appreciate just about every word you've said. So I thank you. Thank all of you for coming and for being a part of this conversation. It's best of luck. To have published 5 books in 13, not even 13 years, 12 years, is pretty amazing. Keep it up. You are percolating. It's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marie. It's my honor to be with you here. Thanks, Politics of Prose, and all of you.
Once again,